Welcome to the Unitarian Church of Los Alamos. My name is James Carroll. Whoever you are, wherever you are in your life's journey, whomever you love, whatever you believe, you're welcome here. Today, we're going to do part 5 of our Mormonism series. This one is the believer's perspective, is what I titled it. It's part of our Unitarian Universalist Comparative Religion Adult RE offering. There is a webpage which has links to recordings of the different classes we've had, as well as extra readings, things you can look up, recommended resources, that sort of thing. Last month we did mindfulness and meditation. It was part 4 of our Buddhism class. This month we were supposed to do part 5, where we're going to talk about Theravada Buddhism and Mahayana Buddhism, and we're not going to do that. And so you'll have to wait till next month to do that. We had an opportunity, so we just kind of jumped on it, and we're calling an audible, and we're going to do something else this month. This Sunday, I want to remind everyone that the Biblical Scholarship and Literacy class is going to be at a new time. So if you're going to come to that, it'll be after the service at 11:15 here instead of in there where we normally have been doing it. And we're going to cover Exodus 3 through 10 if you want to read ahead and prepare for what we're going to cover. I want to remind everyone that we've done these lectures, several series of lectures on Mormonism. We did part 1 where we talked about the influences on Joseph Smith, the things that happened in his life. Oh, so I guess I should mention, the reason we call the audible is because today we're going to do that part 5 on Mormonism. So what we've already covered, we did the influences on Joseph Smith, then we did the Book of Mormon, so the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, Joseph's translation, how he found it, that sort of thing. We talked about the later life of Joseph Smith all the way to Nauvoo and to his death, and then we talked briefly about Brigham Young taking them to the believers to Salt Lake in Utah. We talked after that about beliefs and practices. This is where we covered things like what Mormons would call the plan of salvation. And by the way, I'm using the term Mormon to refer broadly to all the different sects that began through Joseph Smith. The specific people who are here today to talk to us are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which is by far the largest of the various Mormon sects. Then we talked about temples. So we talked about Mormon rituals, baptism, endowment, etc. And so all of that was from my perspective, and I do know a lot about Mormonism because I was a Mormon at one point in my life, but again, it was from an academic perspective, etc. It wasn't from a believer's perspective. And I would like to do this for a lot of the different religions we've covered. I'm looking for people to come to talk about Hinduism, etc. And we'll do the same thing. We'll try to go back to previous lectures and have a believer speak about them. And so that's what we're going to do today. We're going to let some believers in Mormonism come and give you their perspective, which will be different from mine as a non-believer giving the academic perspective. And I do want to ask quickly, how many of you were here for these? Do you remember these lectures? So you were here. So everyone here, that's good because they'll want to know. But that doesn't mean you remember it all. That's fine. This was more than a year ago. So anyway, so today, like I said, the bishop of the LDS congregation, they call them wards, from across the street, Bishop Scott has agreed to come speak to us, and 2 of the full-time missionaries have agreed to come speak to us. The LDS Church is a missionary church. This is a graph on which you unfortunately can't really read the numbers on this projector, but this is the number of LDS missionaries serving full-time. And so to give you a perspective, there's approximately 65,000 members of the LDS Church who are serving as a full-time missionary. And full-time means they get up in the morning and they proselyte until they go to bed at night. Basically, it's all day, every day, and they get one day off to do their laundry and that sort of thing called their P-Day. At least it was when I was a missionary. And of course, there's this nice picture of me as a missionary. Probably you don't recognize me, but that's me on the right without a beard and without long hair as a missionary. And so I did this. I remember what this is like. I served in Florida, Fort Lauderdale. Missionaries serve at their own expense, and they serve full-time. And most of the 65,000 missionaries are young, 18, 19, 20, some in 21, but they're young, and they take 2 years or 18 months out of their life to do this full time. And so it's a fairly big deal and a fairly big investment. And I know that is something that as Unitarian Universalists, we usually kind of find surprising and shocking, because we are not a missionary church. We don't convert, we don't proselytize. In fact, there's a wonderful joke. This is, what do you get if you cross a Mormon and a Unitarian, besides me? Someone who knocks on your door to ask you what you believe. So this effort in missionary work is surprising to us, which is why I was so excited to have missionaries be willing to come and speak to us. And we took a lot of effort, and I was surprised that they were willing, and they were. And so I want to make sure that they have a good experience and that they come away glad that they came. And so I would ask a couple things in what we're going to do next. I'm going to turn the time over. Who's speaking first? Are you speaking? Okay, so Bishop Scott is going to start. I'll turn the time over to him, and I'll let them run the meeting, basically. And they'll say whatever they want to say. They'll take the time as they want. They'll divide it how they want. And we're not going to interrupt or anything, so it'll be about 45 minutes to an hour, depending on what they want to do, where they will just present to us Mormonism as they see it, and as they understand it, and what it means to them. And then we'll try to hold our questions. So don't ask questions, just wait till the end. At the end, we'll have some time for questions. I have, and you wanted to do the mic version, right? So I've got mics here. We'll pass them around. You can ask whatever question you want, and they'll answer it. But I would ask just a couple things about that when we pass the mic around. You know the difference between an inquisitive question and a gotcha question, right? So there are guests here. We want to make them feel welcome. Our job is to understand what it's like to be a believer. That's the point of a comparative religion class, as I teach them, right? Not to debate with them, not to argue with them. And so feel free to ask. If there's something you really want to know, you can ask it, but make sure that these are constructive questions and that there's no conflict. Does that make sense? I do want to mention this. I do this every time I teach especially about Mormonism or something. And this is why I do this. This is from the Dalai Lama. He says, in my long years as a refugee, I have been fortunate to meet many other Buddhists. This has helped me greatly to improve my understanding of their tradition while deepening my appreciation of other religious faiths too. I have found that extending our understanding of each other's spiritual practices and traditions can be an enriching experience, because to do so increases our opportunities for mutual respect. Often we encounter things in another tradition that helps us better appreciate something in our own. So that's why we're doing this, right? We're not doing this to debate. We're not doing it to argue. We want to understand another tradition. And if you've ever followed my Facebook page, you know there's another time and a place to argue if you want, right? We can do that on my Facebook page, and we can do something different here. So that being said, I want to turn the time over first to Brother Scott, and then I think he's going to turn the time over to the missionaries. For those of you who are watching online, the mission president has asked that we not record the missionaries, and so that section of this is probably going to be cut out for those of you who are online, but for those of you who are here, you get the whole thing, and then for those online, you'll still get to listen to Bishop Scott, et cetera. So thank you. Let's turn the time over to Brother Scott. We're going to have to switch slides here, so give us just a second while we swap laptops.
All right. Well, thank you for the opportunity to come here. This is impressive that you would invite us here. I appreciate James. I watched 4 of his videos. He did a great job talking about the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and kind of where we came from. So before I get started, I'm Bishop Scott. Just so you know, in the LDS Church, everybody, there are no professionals. We are all lay leaders, meaning I have a job at the lab, and that's what I do full time. This is just something I've been asked to do temporarily. And I'm fairly new. So this is a new thing for me as well, being a bishop, and I'll talk about a little bit of what that is. But before I get started, I wanted to know a little bit about this audience. So all those who, and I wanted to ask you about your belief in God, if you're okay with that. All those who absolutely, yes, believe in God, can you raise your hand? All right. all those who they think God is there, all right? Can't decide, agnostic, couple, 1, 2, 3. Probably not, and absolutely not. Okay, all right. So we got the whole spectrum, and this is great. I appreciate that. Okay, so since James went over this a year ago, I realize that your memory may not be perfectly sharp on exactly what was said. So I'll give a 60-second slide on how the church was founded. So in the top left corner there, the spring of 1820, a boy, age 14, in New York, read in the Bible and was inspired to go pray about God and what was true. His parents had different religions, and he was a little confused. He saw a vision of heavenly beings, and then a few years later, 7 years later, about 3 years later, he was told about an ancient record that was buried, golden plates. You probably remember that. He went and he found the plates on this hill near his home. He then went back to that location every year for 4 years, and on the 4th year, every year he would meet an angel by the name of Moroni, and on the 4th year, he let him take the plates. And then about 6 months later, he begins the translation process, and you can see a picture of him translating, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. A few years later, he organizes the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and then that was in New York. The church moved to Kirtland, Ohio, then it kind of split. Then we went to Missouri, then went to Nauvoo, and then finally in 1844, when Joseph Smith was 38 years old, he was martyred or killed by a mob. So that's kind of the beginnings of the church in 60 seconds. Now the theology, I'll do the same thing to remind you on that. We tend to throw up this plot a lot, and James had something that was nearly identical to it. We refer to it as the plan of salvation or the plan of happiness. And the idea is that before we came to earth, we existed as spirit children of God, and we refer to as a premortal existence. And in that time, God presented a plan, and it was about how to help us progress or grow or to become like him. And I know James talked quite a bit about that. We agreed to this plan, at least a large chunk of us. Those who did not are referred to Satan and his followers. The rest of us came to earth. Our memory of the preexistence was wiped out. We came to this earth so that we would have an opportunity to make our own choice. I can't emphasize enough that one of the critical components of this whole plan was agency, or the right, free will. And so that was part of the reasoning behind this veil of forgetfulness. So we came to earth to make our own decisions, to grow, but we also experience sin, and we also experience death. So Christ, as part of this plan, came here to earth. He overcame sin by the atonement. He was resurrected and therefore allowed us to be resurrected. That was a gift. So after we die, we go to the spirit world, and there we wait until we are resurrected, and then we're judged based upon our actions and our choices on earth, and then essentially we're saved. Our church is about as close to universalism as you can get, in the sense that we believe everyone is saved to a degree. And so from there, that's kind of, our theology, the purpose, where we came from. James spoke of this as well, why we're here on earth and where we're going, and, the purpose. Okay. From there, I just wanted to give you a basis of our church history and theology. I'm going to turn it over to the full-time missionaries and let them speak about what it's like to be a missionary, and what they do and why they chose to do what they do. questions again. If you think of something, hang on to them and feel free to ask them afterwards. Thank you, Elder. So I tend to like to walk, so this is really hard for me to sit in one spot when I'm speaking, but I'm going to try. I wanted to give you a little bit about my background. They mentioned they were from Utah, and we all have heard, that Mormon families are large. I have 12 siblings, so there's 13 of us. This is just my siblings, their spouses and kids, and my parents are in the middle there. My father passed away in January. But yeah, so this is my extended family. So yes, we can have large families. So places I've lived. I was born in Moscow, Idaho. I don't remember that. I was too young. We moved to Arizona in Snowflake, kind of up in the White Mountains, a little town. It was settled by Mormon pioneers. So it was largely LDS. And then I moved to Utah when I was a teenager. I went to graduate school in Texas A&M. I went to BYU Provo for undergraduate, then moved to Texas for graduate school. And then I moved here to Los Alamos after school, and I'd spent 3 years in DC on a change of station as well during this time period. So I've been here about 15 years. I served my mission in Japan. So yeah, I'd spent 2 years there, and that was a wonderful experience. One thing the elders didn't mention, as you'll notice, you'll always see them in pairs. You are required to stay with your companion 24/7. You're never to leave there unless you're in your apartment or going to the bathroom, obviously, things like that, but you have to be in sight of each other 24/7. So that's a new experience, right? As a 19-year-old, 18-year-old, to suddenly be stuck with someone that was assigned to you. It switches about every 2 to 3 months, and you have to be their best friend. So, yeah, I'm now here in Los Alamos. This is my immediate family, my oldest daughter here, and you're welcome to ask her questions as well. I have 5 children, and I'm a nuclear engineer is my background, so this is a picture I took of the trigger reactor at Texas A&M. All right, so let's get into the meat here. So I largely based what I would like to share with you off of what James shared. James did a great job going over the background and theology of our church. But I also think hearing the same thing, but from a believer's perspective, you'll maybe get some nuances that weren't there before, and that you may have missed. So I wanted to go over just quickly over how the Book of Mormon came to be. So I mentioned earlier that Joseph Smith, he physically obtained these plates in 1827, September, and he was told not to show them to anyone. And so, I know immediately everyone's thinking, oh, he's got a prop, right? And because he's not allowed to show anyone. And I just want you to think in your mind, if it was true, what it would be like to have to tell someone, I have these plates, but you can't see them, just trust me, right? The just trust me part, that's everybody goes, yeah, right. And I totally understand that, totally get it. So after he received the plates, he was kind of dabbling, trying to figure this thing out. He really wasn't sure what to do. And he started, James mentioned before, he had this cadre of people that he was digging for treasure when he was younger, and they were starting to harass him. And so he ended up moving to his wife's home about 100 miles away in Pennsylvania. So during this time, he had to move 100 miles. And back then, that was not a trivial thing. Then in February, he connected with, he knew Martin Harris earlier, but Martin Harris agreed to help him translate. So Joseph was not a well-educated person. He had an elementary education just from traveling teachers. They would come to people's homes or the area, and they'd send their kids when there was a teacher around. And he wrote letters to Emma because it was at times a long-distance relationship. And he misspelled things. He was a horrible writer. But it progressed. Later on in life, he was very eloquent, very, very well-spoken, and wrote really well. But early on, he was not. You would not have been impressed if you were on the other side of his letters as a young woman who was educated, who was brought up probably a little more well-off than Joseph was. So they spent 4 months or so translating a portion of the Book of Mormon, and James mentioned this, 116 pages worth. And then Martin, who was getting a lot of grief from his wife, wanted to show her the work he was doing because his wife did not believe at all in what they were doing. And there was this back and forth. Joseph said, I went and prayed to God. Some of you may remember this. He said no. Martin insisted. He prayed again. God said no. Martin insisted again. And then finally God told Joseph, okay, I'll let you take it, but under these conditions. And so off Martin goes. He takes the 116 pages back to New York, 100 miles away. And during this time, his wife, Emma, gave birth to their first child, who was born with severe deformities and died the same day. This was a really hard time in Joseph Smith's life, this period. And so Martin has the pages. He's not even thinking about, the Book of Mormon, and his wife, and him just lost their first child. After a few weeks, Martin hasn't come back. He's starting to get really worried. What's going on? He agreed. And so he went to Palmyra, and then a week later came back, and he was just distraught because Martin revealed that he had lost these 116 pages. And so the angel Moroni, who gave him the plates, Joseph said he took the plates back and took back his ability to translate. He took that mission from him. And that once again, this was just a deep, dark time in Joseph's life. He was very depressed, and it was hard. After a while, after a lot of prayers, God said, I'll give you back the plates and you can resume translation. So in September, later that year, the angel returned the plates to Joseph, but he no longer had a scribe because Martin Harris was no longer part of that. Oliver Cowdery, who was actually back in Palmyra as a traveling teacher, was interacted with Joseph's family, and he kind of, after some prodding, they finally told him the story, and he felt compelled to go to Pennsylvania, Harmony, and meet Joseph in person. And within a short period of time after meeting Joseph, he agreed to be Joseph's scribe. And within, so in April, Oliver came, then they started in earnest translating. Emma, his wife, did a little bit of scribe work prior to that, but very little. The vast majority of what we know as the Book of Mormon today came about from that time period of April to 1828 to June 1828. So within a 3-month span or so, the Book of Mormon was written. Now, my daughter, Brooklyn here, just published her first book as an author. She is just had a great desire to write most of her teenage life. And we just published it on Amazon this past week. And it took a lot of work, a lot of editing, a lot of rewrites, going over the storyline, making sure it all connected. And you may not necessarily appreciate how miraculous maybe not the right word here, but difficult it is to write a book like the Book of Mormon within 3 months, or let's say the time you received the plates from 1827 to 1828. So a year or so. And so when we read the stories about what it was like, people who wrote in their journals, he dictated to a scribe, and when they took breaks, he never once asked them to repeat back, where did we leave off? He literally just started right into it, both overnight and during the day when they took meal breaks. It's 531 pages. It covers the bulk of it, and James went over this a little bit, 1,000-year time period. And so there's just lots of people. The more characters, right? It's the harder to keep track of them, how they interact, geography, just to keep track of that storyline would be incredibly hard. And to remember, he was not educated at this time period. He was not well-spoken. And James has a greater appreciation for this than I ever would because he studies ancient languages. The way things are written were characteristic of the way some of the Hebrews wrote. Chiasma is a common example, if you're familiar with that term, and that's a poetic use of how you describe something. And that wasn't even discovered until 40 years ago. There was no knowledge of what chiasm was and that the Hebrews wrote that way. And there's multiple instances of chiasma in the Book of Mormon. The way they use certain language terms are very similar to how Hebrews would have written. There's just lots of things that you look at this and you say, let's say he even made the whole thing up and he was thinking of it since he was 16 years old. He didn't even have money to buy paper to actually translate or write this book. He asked Martin Harris, he asked Oliver Cowdery to buy the paper because he didn't have any. So he didn't have, and he worked hard. From a teenage boy, he was on a farm. So he did not have lots of time sitting home, coming up with the storyline, how this all fits together. The geography, there's lots of references to geography, and when they put it together, it all fits, throughout, just little snippets, and yet they all fit. Just to even do that would be really, really hard. So this book would just be incredibly difficult for someone just to make up. There's some, just one last thing, some ideas that float around. Well, maybe he had Oliver Cowdery and Martin Harris worked with him on this, or even Signe Rignan, who was more educated. They'd collaborated on this, because if you look at the contextual styles, there's different authors, just like what the Book of Mormon claims to be. So, but yet he only knew Oliver for 3 months by the time they published it. So the idea that they got together and spent time doing this is just a little, it raises questions of how it could be done. I'll talk a little bit more about it here in a minute, but another thing that James mentioned in his presentation was a lady by the name of Elsa Johnson. So Elsa, she lived in Kirtland, Ohio. So that was the first place the church moved to after being founded in New York. And he moved to Kirtland, and he interacted with Elsa's son Lyman, who joined the church and was very excited about the church. And he wrote to his mother and said, hey, I encourage you to read about these new Mormons that are in the area, right? And so she started, reading a little bit about it, and she wanted to meet Joseph. And so she traveled 30 miles from their farm in Hiram, I'm not sure how they pronounce it, Ohio, to Kirtland, and met Joseph. And she claimed to have had an injured arm. And depending on the account, there's 2 journal accounts, and we'll read one here in a second, that talk about how Joseph healed her arm, and then she became a believing, most of their family became believers, and they joined the Mormon church. And and I don't think this was intentional, but when James presented this topic, there was a few chuckles in the audience, and my immediate thought was, okay, Joseph coordinated this with her before, so when they had this group of people, she could claim that her arm was hurt and healed miraculous. That's exactly what I think when I see this on TV, right? There's not an inkling of belief. I totally get that. But let me tell you a little bit more about the story. So this is a journal from Amos Hayden, who was never a believer, and he described the circumstances. And so she said that Miss Johnson came the night before, so she had never met Joseph before. There was a Methodist preacher and a doctor in the room, and they were having this discussion, and they were talking about her arm. And after some discussion, Joseph comes from the back of the room, and he says these words, "Woman, in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, I command thee to be whole." And then he kind of left. And then her arm was, they asked how her arm was doing, and it was great, and she lifted it with ease. And on the next day, she was able to do her washing without difficulty or pain. There's another account as well, but for time, I'm not going to read it. What I do want to talk about is actually the fact that Elsa left the church. And James talked about this a little bit as well. Shortly after this point, let's see, the dates, February of 1831, so about 6 years later, the Johnson family, they were stalwarts in the church. They were very supportive. But Kirtland, the church in Kirtland, they were very poor, and they were trying to build this new temple. It was a ginormous sacrifice, this big building. They were poor, and they were having some very difficult financial problems. And in fact, it wasn't even just to Kirtland. The whole area was under crisis. And it's known, in history as the National Bank Crisis, as the Panic of 1837. And so Joseph is trying to get money together, and so he decides to organize a local bank, which was really common back then, called the Kirtland Safety Society. He was denied a banking permit, and so he set up an anti-banking, committee, and he formed the bank anyways. And the Johnson family was the largest shareholder, meaning they upfronted the most money out of anyone outside of the Smith family. And shortly afterwards, the bank failed, as most of the small banks did in that area, and they lost all their money. And it was really bitter. The Johnson family was quite bitter about this. And you can understand that, right? This is Joseph. He's the prophet. Things are supposed to work out right? That's what prophets do. If you really believe they're prophets, you do what they say, and then you're blessed. That's how it works, right, in the Bible. And it didn't. And that was really hard, as it would be for any of us who listen to a prophet or a leader of your church. And they did. They ended their relationship with the church. And yet, here's the question I ask. Never at any period did Elsa deny that miracle of the healing of her arm. So if you're really bitter towards someone, why would you not say, you know what? We actually conspired before to make this miracle happen so that you would believe. All right. One other story, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about why I personally believe. The three witnesses. James also spoke about this. After the Book of Mormon was translated, God said, he's hiding these plates under a cloth. Lots of people had picked them up. They'd felt them, including his wife, but no one had actually seen it, right? How can you say they're a prop or real? After the translation, God said, okay, I'll let you pick three people who I approve, and they can actually hold and fill the plates, and they can be witnesses, right? And they claimed, each one of them claimed that not only did they get to see the plates, an angel came and showed it to them and testified of it to them in person. What later on happened is all three of those witnesses left the church under some pretty difficult circumstances. And you read about it and you go, yeah, I'm very sympathetic to why they left the church. Those were not, I totally get it. But they were not very friendly towards the church, and church members made even some death threats towards them, two of them. And so they were not on friendly terms. Towards later on in his life, one of the witnesses, known as David Whitner, and they were harassed after they left the church by non-believers saying, denounce it, denounce this testimony. And this is one of Whitmer's responses to this, to him being pressured later on in his life to denounce the Book of Mormon. He said his answer was unequivocal, that he saw the plates and heard the angel with unmistakable clearness. Martin Harris, who we talked about, who was the scribe at the beginning, he too was pressured heavily to denounce this witness. And he gave an affidavit who said, "Gentleman," holding out his hand, "do you see that hand? Are you sure you see it? Or are your eyes playing a trick or something?" "No." "Well, as sure as you see my hand, so sure did I see the angel and the plates." And they denounced Joseph, but they used a word, fallen. That was a very common term. Joseph has fallen. They didn't ever deny who he was or the spiritual experiences they had when they knew him in the beginning. It was always he was fallen. Once he was a prophet, and now he's fallen. And they never denounced, no three of them, none of the three denounced their testimonies even till death, despite being heavily pressured to do so. One more comment, and then we'll kind of wrap up here. Well, not a comment, but I want to talk about a story in the Bible. This is when Christ was interacting with the people, and the story of him feeding the 5,000. If you're familiar with the Bible, this is a very common story. And it talks about this crowd coming, and he heals them. And then he feeds them, right? The 5 loaves, I want to say, and 2 fishes. And he blesses it, and he's able to feed this crowd of 5,000. How could you not believe after seeing something like that, right? And then he went across the Sea of Galilee, and the people followed him. And so either the next day or soon after, the crowd, because he left at night, and so they weren't aware, and then the crowd woke up and they're, where did Jesus go? And, they eventually figured out he crossed the sea at night, and so they go to follow him, and they catch up with him, and he's got this crowd of people who are eager, right? But Jesus, it said, he perceived that they were there just to get another free meal, not because they really wanted to hear what he had to say. And so he gave a different sermon, and he talked about what we usually refer to as the Sacrament, where he says, in John 6:53, this is from the King James, I'm not sure what version of the Bible or translation you use. "Verily, verily, I say unto you, except ye eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, ye have no life in you." And then he goes on to talk about this. Can you imagine what it was like for those people hearing those words to say, going from healing and breaking bread to, unless you eat of my flesh and drink my blood? You're like, boy, this guy's off his rocker. He's talking about cannibalism. And that's exactly what they thought. It says a few verses later, it says, "Therefore many of his disciples, when they had heard this, said, 'This is a hard saying. Who can hear it?' And then it goes on to say they followed him no more." So why would Christ give this sermon when he knew full well that it would cause a lot of confusion and even turn away a lot of his followers. Makes no sense, right? I mean, they were eager. Why? And this is where all three of those stories I was talking about, back to my faith. When I was a young missionary, or before I went on a mission, I was so eager to serve a mission. It was something I looked forward to. You talked about it. They tell stories. You have no idea how hard it is to be a missionary until you do it. James is laughing because you went to Florida and know what it's like. Can you imagine what it's like to do it in a foreign language you can barely speak? In Japan, it was hard, but I knew the church was true. I had such an ideal faith. I just knew it was true, and I was confident, and I did. I had a great experience. It was hard, and if there was time, I could share some stories from that. Come home. I went to BYU, got married, did the normal Mormon thing, started having a family. But I'm an engineer, a scientist. I did physics as an undergraduate nuclear engineer, as a graduate student. I enjoy learning. Brooklyn can attest, I'm always reading books. And all sorts of subjects, including church history. And I think James did mention this in his talks about when growing up in the church and going to Sunday school, they kind of teach a very idealistic, or what is commonly referred to by outsiders as a whitewashed version of church history. Everything worked out, the saints were never at fault, and you followed the prophet, and everything worked out. And when you read those stories, for real, and actually go look at them, which they do openly publish, but they don't necessarily teach in Sunday school and church. Wow, it's complicated. You have some people who went through some hard things. You have them following the prophet the best they could, and it just fell apart. The prophet was wrong, Joseph Smith, all the time. And then you learn about the difficulties, blacks in the priesthood. James talked about that. We have nowadays LGBTQ issues, the role of women in our church. But historically, it's a lot more complicated, and there's a lot of hard things. Polygamy, right? Polygamy, that's a hard, my stomach just turns, right? I've read a lot about polygamy and what it was like to be, a woman in those circumstances from the journals. It was hard. There were some really difficult circumstances. And you begin to wonder, how could this be true? And the doubt floods in, and you question why you're doing this, and what did I do? I went on a mission. I taught this. What would my wife think? What would my family think? What if God doesn't exist? If I decide this is all made up, how do I even tell my wife, who loves being in the church? And I have great sympathy, compassion for James, who had to go through that. What an incredibly difficult experience. Because your extended family, or your in-laws, and I assume our own family, are still active members? Yes. That would have been hard. Trust me, I've had a lot of those thoughts. How would I tell my wife? I don't know if I believe this anymore. And I begin, what do I benefit from being a member of this church? Do I just pretend that I believe it for the sake of my family? And I'm sure James had many of these same questions. He's laughing over there, yeah. And to be honest, I stuck it out because I knew there were good things that I benefited from the church, being a member of the church, not necessarily because my faith was all that miraculous. And I'm so glad I did. And I read a book recently called Faith is Blind, and he talks about this progression of faith. And this is not unique to Mormonism. This is, other Christian sects have talked about this as well. And it talks about how faith can progress from this ideal, absolute surety, knowledge, to suddenly you realize the world's not so complex, and there's plenty of things that would persuade you not to believe. And there's plenty of things, like I spoke about before, that this has got to be true. And you have both sides. And that goes back to the plan of salvation that I mentioned earlier, this ideal of agency and faith. And it suddenly began to form in my mind, this is what it means to have faith. Faith includes doubt. Faith includes uncertainty. And we don't necessarily like to talk about it much over there, or over there, wrong way. And, as bishop, remember, I'm new, I tried to be open about that. I tried to be open about that with my daughter. We talk about the hard things just as much as the good things. And in this book, they talk about, you go through this ideal phase, this realization that it's more complex, and then on the other side of complexity, talks about how you begin to accept that complexity. You accept that ambiguity, and you're okay with it. And I'm starting to come to that point of, I'm okay with that knowledge that there's plenty of evidence that our church is not true. And there's plenty of evidence that it is. And I have the picture of a bubble. We have our little truth, and we like to cling to it, and it makes us feel warm and fuzzy. And it's really hard to study things that don't agree with it, right? It's uncomfortable. And we like to go around and pop everyone else's bubble. My bubble's okay, your bubble, your bubble's the problem, and we're all clinging to our own faith and our ideas and what makes sense in our head, our logic. And it's part of this life, why we came to earth. Because if God revealed himself, rode across in a chariot of fire every day across the sky, or had an angel, come down and give a sermon, it would be easy to believe, right? It's obvious. But what that takes away is a little bit or a large part of our agency or choice. It is now no longer much, much harder or less of a choice to not believe. God will always give you plenty of evidence not to believe and to believe, and it's simply up to you. It is a choice. And in James 1:3 it says, "The trial of your faith worketh patience." Our faith will be tried. And Jane spoke a little bit about the psychology of faith. There is an academic group within the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints called Fair Mormons, and they're very academically oriented. As James mentioned, our church is probably the only church out there where education correlates to stronger faith. Think about that. We have members who are across the board of all scientists, engineers. We encourage it. We want you to get an education. I was told from a youth, you've got to go and get an education. And so even psychologists are faith-believing members, and they understand some of that. Okay, is this my mind, right? And it isn't to convince you. I'm not saying this that. What I'm not trying to do is say, there's a bunch of whole smarter people than you that believe it, so you should too. That's not what I'm trying to say at all. What I'm trying to say is, I think faith and belief is a little bit more complex. And sometimes we tell a story, we kind of laugh at it and say, that's silly, why you would believe that. And as Unitarians, you are much more gracious than others. And I get that. I'm preaching to the choir, right? But sometimes we need to take a step back and maybe appreciate a little bit more that there might be more to the story and very reasonable reasons why somebody believes what they do. And us Mormons aren't all crazy kooks. Okay, last little bit. I want to talk about, this is the last slide, what it's like to be a bishop. I did not seek to be a bishop. Trust me, nobody wants to be a bishop. I have a family. I have hobbies. I have things that I'm working on. My house is a mess because I'm trying to renovate it. And they asked me to be bishop, and being bishop is usually a 5 to 6 year commitment. That's huge. And I'm not sure exactly how it's done here, but most pastors will tell you that is a big commitment. I spend my days helping people who are struggling with depression, with marriage counseling, who are just having a hard time, who have a hard time with their faith. And I, who have an unperfect faith, is supposed to buoy them up. I have lots of people who are struggling with illnesses. I've done 2 funerals already. And we go around and we help those who are struggling. We make sure they get to doctor appointments, or and they broke their leg and they have care and get professional care in. Occasionally, I haven't done yet, I do a marriage, but typically that's done in a temple. But occasionally, I may do that. I also have my own family. I organize the church in the sense of making sure everybody has a responsibility. Everybody's doing something. We refer to it as a calling. I'm called as a bishop. So that's my responsibility. James mentioned that we use the term key within the priesthood to actually administer or organize the church. I do not give sermons on Sunday. I assign that to the congregation. So every Sunday, a couple members from the congregation come and they give a short sermon. I'll take a turn occasionally, but it's largely by the congregation. So everything's congregational, run by the congregation. I'm just organizing it. It still takes an incredible amount of my time. And we do not debate over theology that much or agonize over, what other churches believe and, how we can combat them. There are just sincere people, just like you, who are trying to do good things in their life, overcome trials, and just become more Christ-like. I can tell you they're filled with a lot of very sincere, dedicated people who are just trying to do good things and be a good person, just like you are. And I know James is as well. With that, I'll end there. That to say, I do not know if God lives. I do not know if the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is the only true and living church, but I do have faith, very sincere and heartfelt faith that God lives, and have experienced many things in my own life to help me make that belief. And I do have faith that our church is acceptable before God and is his true church on earth. But it is a faith. With that, we'll open it up to questions, and I'm good with, you won't offend me. I promise. You can ask any question you want. You won't offend me.
So before we do that, can we thank him for coming? So I'm going to make one clarification because I think there's probably going to be confusion. A bishop in the LDS Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is a lot more like a pastor.
Yes.
So his job is similar to John's than it is a bishop in the Catholic Church, et cetera. So that might have caused some confusion in his explanation. The other thing is that he's not paid. Unlike Reverend John, we don't pay Reverend John enough, and he's not paid at all. And yet his job is very, very similar, minus the sermon every month. So, and probably more involved because he does what they call worthiness interviews and makes callings, and his job is probably bigger than John's in that sense. So it's a pretty impressive thing to be willing to do for 5 years. as a volunteer. So. All right, questions? Let me pass these around.
Thank you. I'll go first. So, what language are the tablets written in? Was that ever defined?
Yeah, James went over it if you read or if you watch this video. They referred to it as Reformed Egyptian, and we have no explanation of what that is or what that means. But in the Book of Mormon, one of the authors says, I would write in Hebrew, but it's way too long, and so because I'm writing on gold plates and it's precious, I'm going to write in Reformed Egyptian because it's more compact. And we're not given any more explanation than that.
Are there other denominations?
Are there other denominations?
And how would they differ?
Yeah, great question. So when Joseph died, there was a lot of confusion, and once again, James did go over this in his videos. I'm happy to share it, but I'm just saying if you want a more in-depth explanation, you can go listen to his talk again. But there was some confusion on the progression of leadership or to replace Joseph as prophet. And there were largely 4, if I remember my memory, maybe 5 groups, but 2 large ones. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, where I'm from, is by far the largest sect. They went to Utah and is pretty much what we think of as Mormons today. There were other groups that quickly, died off because they were too small. One group called the Restored Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Reorganized.
Reorganized, thank you. Thank you. Reorganized, and now they're known as the Community of Christ. And they own some of the Kirtland Temple, the original, some original land from church history, and very liberal, I think is how you put it, version of our church. And then after that, Brigham Young, who was the next successor to Joseph Smith, moved to Utah, and as probably most of you know, practiced polygamy. Eventually, polygamy they said we're no longer going to practice it. It's part of our doctrine, but it's not being practiced anymore. And certain groups said, no, we want to keep practicing polygamy, and they broke off. And then, throughout the ages, there's been small groups of people who break off, but largely inconsequential. But that's kind of the history.
What were the Missouri group?
Their Missouri group. So Joseph Smith did try to establish Zion, as he referred to it, in 2 different locations, Jackson County and Clay County. There was one other, anyways. And so that was part of the church history. I don't know if strong. I don't know of any groups that actually are known as the Missouri group. James, correct? Yeah, I think that's just part of church history.
The Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, that is now the Community of Christ, moved to, or they were in Missouri. They stayed behind in Nauvoo when Brigham took the saints to Utah, and they very quickly moved back to Missouri. And so their church headquarters is in Missouri. And so when we think of the Missouri group, we're probably thinking of the Community of Christ. There's another group there called the Hendrickites, or the Church of the Temple Lot, something like that. And they own the lot where Joseph said he was going to build the temple. I had the opportunity to argue with one of their apostles for a good 3 hours one day. That was a lot of fun. But they're a very small group, and they're in Missouri.
So I think the membership of the main body is about 16 million, I want to say, if I'm going off memory, somewhere around there. So, worldwide, that's tiny, drop in the bucket. But, the other splinter groups, you're probably talking in the tens of thousands at most.
If you don't mind, and I really want to make sure you get to spend most of them, but when you're talking about splinter groups, one of the most interesting right now are called the Remnant Mormons. One of my mission companions is a member of the Remnant Mormons, and they they're fascinating. If you want to talk about them at some point, they're a very interesting group. There was an individual named Denver Snuffer who kind of started that particular movement by claiming that there was no kind of prophetic leadership, and that everyone should kind of do it for themselves. And now the problem, of course, is everyone in his movement is doing it for themselves, and he's having the same problem. People don't listen to him anymore in the same way he didn't listen to the Mormon prophet. And just kind of from a sociology of religion, that group is beyond fascinating. And so they're a lot of fun to watch too, and you can read about them online, and they've got their own scriptures out and all sorts of fun stuff now. So.
I'd like to better understand the ways in which the women contribute to the Church of the Latter-day Saints, and if you see, do you have any possibility for women bishops or for women giving the sermons?
Yes, a great question. Thank you for asking. In many ways, our church has been progressive for a long time, and in other ways, we're not so much. They've always been able to give sermons on Sunday congregations. They could say the prayers. They have their own organization within our church called the Relief Society that Joseph Smith organized, that they largely run, and it's geared a lot towards service and making sure the women have a place to go. They have their own meeting on Sunday where they organize their own sermons and a Sunday school of sorts. However, in the church leadership, we have a priesthood, like a lot of other Christian sects do have. It is only given to men, and pretty much all active members are given the priesthood. Unlike, other congregations, just the leadership, all males are given the priesthood, and then they're called to do leadership on occasion. The upper leadership in the church at Salt Lake is all men. They do have a general Relief Society presidency, but essentially they're the ones that declare doctrine, who decide what the policies are. They will receive input from the women in upper leadership, but it's largely up to the men. And so that regard, they don't have the voice that maybe some think they should. Just 2 weeks ago, and policy like these things is very top down, meaning I don't get to decide how churches run and how leadership is organized. There's a handbook, and I have to follow it. And they'll release me. They'll let me go if I don't. So there's some leeway, but I can't make a woman a pastor. They'll release me on the spot. One last comment. But personally, I try really hard to make sure women had a voice in my congregation. In fact, we met just 2 weeks ago with the leadership within my congregation and said, what can I do better? What can I do to make sure your voice is heard? And I invited them to sit on the stand with me, up here, as much latitude as I absolutely could without breaking, the rules. But so in some ways we're very progressive, in some ways we're not.
It's about the word priesthood. In some, at least two religions I know of, the Roman Catholic Church and in ancient times in the Judaism, the priest was one who offered sacrifice. What does priesthood mean in your context?
Yes, and once again, I'll say, if you listen to James, he'll explain a lot of this, but he really did a great job, as you can tell. So the priesthood, back in historical times, we refer to as the Aaronic priesthood in our religion. So that's the priesthood of Aaron, Moses' companion, and the Levites. That was of lineage, right? It was passed on through lineage, not okay, you're worthy and you get it. and they performed the sacrifices in the Old Testament. That was a big deal, and even in the New Testament. And then, James talks about a little bit how that when Christ came, that kind of shifted in our minds of now, so Christ was not from the Levites, right? Yet he had a priesthood, and now Christ opened it up to everyone who was worthy. And so everyone who is worthy, meaning are active and faith-believing, is given the priesthood. And then when you're called or asked to, you're given certain keys or responsibilities, then you can actually act. You have the authority to use that priesthood. So just because you have the priesthood doesn't mean you get to do what you want. It's when you're actually asked to and given the authority to, then you can do certain things. And the main responsibility of priesthood holders in our church is to perform ordinances like baptism, temple ordinances, temple marriages, things like that. And then to give priesthood blessings. So when someone's sick, we go and we give them a blessing of healing.
And I think it's worth mentioning the Eucharist in Mormon circles is
Yes.
called the Sacrament.
Yeah.
But
Thank
that
you.
would have been considered the replacement for sacrifice. And
Right.
it also requires the priest to bless in the same way that the priest would have offered the sacrifice.
So when Christ implemented the sacrament, that was in lieu of an animal sacrifice. So we do that weekly.
Were you called to be a bishop by your local ward or by
Yeah, once again.
Salt Lake City?
Yeah. So we have different levels of leadership. Above a bishop, which is equivalent to a pastor, we have a regional leadership called a stake president, and he covers the northern New Mexico area. And so when it was time, he was asked, his job is to find a new bishop within our congregation. And it isn't done like by vote. There's no voting on any responsibilities. You're simply asked and you either accept or decline. So as this regional leader, stake president, he looked at our congregation and said, oh, Mark needs, he has too much time on his hand. Let's make him bishop. And he submitted my name to Salt Lake, and they pray about it, and it comes back from upper leadership, Quorum of the 12, saying we approve Mark becoming a bishop, and then he is authorized to actually ordain me and give me the keys of a bishop.
Thank you.
So now, as a Unitarian, the difference between that and the way we do it, right? We consider John, our pastor, works for us.
Yes.
We hired him, and we had a search committee, right? And we all got together and we voted. And if you go to our yearly meetings and how we vote, and how we're in charge of our own budget, how we decide how we're going to spend the money, all of that comes from the congregation. And we, as Unitarians, evolve from the congregational lists, and all that comes through the congregation. And so to wrap your head around what's happening here is very different, because it's coming from the top down instead of from the congregation up. And it's very different.
Yeah, because I wouldn't have voted to become bishop. I just, being bishop, it's a wonderful experience. I'm joking, and it is hard, but it is a wonderful experience to work with people and help them and have that calling. There we go.
Oh. Sorry. Oh, there we go. How has the growth in the church worldwide affected how the church functions? Is that because it was so U.S.-centric as it began?
Absolutely. And so our upper leadership are all, or at least we're all white males from Utah primarily, right? And very U.S.-centric, and yet we're sending missionaries all over the world, and they don't necessarily understand, the different cultures and how that works. We have more Spanish-speaking members of our church than English-speaking. because of the success in South America. Growth in the United States has slowed down quite a bit, just like most Christian sects. In fact, they're usually declining. We're still growing, but it has slowed down quite a bit. Right now, Africa is one of the huge areas of growth. They don't necessarily publish all these statistical details out, but you can glean it, and people do their own studies and stuff. So now we have some Asian Americans from upper leadership. We call equivalent to cardinals or quorum. That we use the term quorum of the 12. One from Germany, some Spanish-speaking ones, and certainly they have started to focus a lot more on outside of the United States, what the policies are, how do we help them, and that's been a progression over decades. One example is our church is very Boy Scout of America centric. Every boy did Boy Scouts of America. That was just a given. And they just recently announced this was a seismic shift, that they are no longer associating with the Boy Scouts of America. And they implemented their own youth program. And one of the primary motivations was they wanted to implement a youth program that was transferable to all countries, because you can't do Boy Scouts of America around the world. So they're very much focused nowadays on how the church functions outside the United States.
I want to address it to your daughter, who I've already forgotten.
Yeah,
her
you can
name.
ask her a question, Brooklyn.
Are you still in high school? You're a senior this year. And can you tell us what your book is about? What its title is?
Oh, sure. So I love to write, and I've been, like my dad said, writing for most of my teenage years. And I started this book in my freshman year, and it's called The Elevator of Quanemi. It's, I want to say, like steampunk fantasy. It's really fun. The setting whole idea is that the ocean is above the sky, and there's an inventor who wants to prove to everyone that the ocean doesn't extend forever, and so he builds an elevator to the top, and that's the basis.
Say the title again.
Oh, it's called The Elevator of Quanemi.
And Quanemi is Icelandic, or where did it come from?
Yeah, it's like Norwegian.
Norwegian. So that's where the word comes from.
Okay, that's what all right. Yeah. Well, congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been really fun.
And if you don't mind me plugging one of my friend's books, there's an individual named Donald Bradley who is writing a book right now on the content of the 116 pages that were lost. He's a believing Mormon, a good friend of mine, and he's having me review some of the chapters. And oh my goodness, you guys are going to love this book, because there is actual evidence from people who read the 116 pages, who wrote down what's in it before it was lost.
I did not know that.
And like I said, I had never heard that even those records existed, and he's gone back and reconstructed what was in that text. And this is going to be amazing when it comes out. So apologize for plugging my own friends, but this is a great book. You're going to have to look this up.
All right, is that it? Well, thank you for being so gracious to come. I know the Friday night to come here and listen to me. This has been a wonderful experience, and we definitely appreciate you inviting us.
Okay, thank you very much for coming. I want to remind you that this Sunday, my class is at a different time. If you're going to come to the Bible class, we are going to talk about Exodus and some of that priesthood stuff that we came up with today. So that'll be a lot of fun, and I hope to see you there. Elders, you have copies, I believe, of the Book of Mormon. There is a copy of the Book of Mormon in our library, if anyone wants one. And I believe they have ones here that they usually give out when they proselyte. So if anyone wants their own copy and wants to read it, and it is an impressive book. I mean, obviously my conclusions about whether it's true or different than Bishop Scott's, but it's an amazing book. And so if you want a copy and to be able to look through it on your own, they'll pass those out. If you don't, that's fine. But if anyone wants a copy, they've got some up here. And you're welcome to come up and ask individual questions as well of the missionaries and of Bishop Scott. And there are refreshments in the Mormons would call it the cultural hall, this room across the hall here. So feel free to come eat there's some strawberries and some wonderful ginger cookies and stuff. So I hope to see you all in there, and we can go in there and move in there, and we can talk more if you want. So thank you again for coming, and I'll see you Sunday.